Hi guys, and welcome back to the UK's human landscape. We are almost at the end of the unit, but in the next two lessons we're going to be looking at something quite different from the things that we've been dealing with before. So previously we've been looking particularly at London as our UK city study. In the next two lessons we're going to be looking at a rural example rather than urban examples of how the UK faces challenges, particularly in social and economic senses in rural areas. So if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so by clicking the button down below. I'd be really grateful. And let's get started. So as we get started then, we're going to introduce you to Cornwall. So Cornwall is a rural area of the UK in the southwest. And I just want you to have a look at these pictures. They perhaps show an idealized version of Cornwall, but nonetheless, I want you to give me an idea of how you would describe Cornwall. So on your worksheet, under the starter task, give me a couple of things that you would say about Cornwall from these images. Maybe you said it was pretty, maybe you said it was cute, maybe you said it was quite English, perhaps you used a reference to primary industries like farming and fishing in here. Perhaps you thought maybe it looks like a nice place to go on holiday. Any of those observations are totally valid. So we're going to move on to locating Cornwall. You need to be able to talk about where it is, and it's useful to be able to suggest where it is in relation to the rest of the UK and London as well. So using these two maps, I'd like you to write me a location description of Cornwall. You need to include, of course, its country, its compass directions, seas and oceans, including the neighbouring ones, and its neighbouring county, not country, neighbouring county, which is the next sort of region of the UK. Pause the video, have a go. So let's have a little look at the types of things that you could have said. Hopefully, as I already kind of gave away, you have identified that Cornwall is in the southwest of England. Okay, it is near to Wales. In fact, over here where the Atlantic Ocean is it also links into the Severn Estuary, which divides England from Wales. And if we look on this more local or more regional map, you can see that Cornwall's neighbouring county is, in fact, Devon. Now, one thing that I hope you notice about Cornwall is that it has a very long coastline. And although the Atlantic Ocean is sort of to the northwest of it, the English Channel, the edge of the English Channel, is to the south. These coastlines with its bays and headlands give us this sort of very pretty landscape that we see in the images that we were looking at before. One other thing that I didn't ask you to do in the task describing where Cornwall is for us to look at this map and identify a little bit about how it's connected. One thing that you might notice is that the roads going into Cornwall are not motorways. They are all A roads. So here the A39, here the A30, here the A390. Okay, all of them are A roads, which means that although they are major roads, they are not motorways. So Cornwall's rural connections are good, but not amazing. Okay, bearing in mind that there are motorways across most of other areas of the UK. You might also have spotted these train stations and the train line that links it all the way down to Penzance. But obviously, looking up here in northern Cornwall, we might find ourselves really quite isolated. Only one major road in and out, no train stations really, other than maybe some very small local ones, and maybe even quite far from the nearest city. So, now that we've located Cornwall, I'd like you to double check your answer. Use a green pen or highlight the changes that you make in green, please. Cornwall is a county located in the southwest of England. To the east or northeast is the neighbouring county of Devon. Cornwall has two coastlines, the English Channel to the south and the Atlantic Ocean to the north. And then if you wanted to, as your challenge, add in a little bit about the fact that northern Cornwall is more isolated than the southern coastal parts of Cornwall. So Cornwall, if you hadn't guessed from those lovely pictures I put up at the top, is one of the UK's most popular regional tourist destinations. And it's known for multiple things. It's pasties, it's clotted cream and ice cream, it's beautiful idyllic coastlines with beaches and harbours and cliffs. It's known for its history of piracy and trade. It's known for its farming and agriculture. And it is, perhaps shockingly to you, in such a pretty place, one of the UK's most deprived areas. The average weekly wage in Cornwall is the lowest in the UK, and that's about £340 a week compared to the UK average of £405 a week and £660 a week in London. So we spent lessons on lessons talking about how areas of London are deprived, and that is absolutely true, but that doesn't mean that rural areas, pretty as they might be, are not also at risk of high deprivation. And in fact, in a rural area, some of the things that can give you opportunities to break away from the deprivation that you might be experiencing might even be fewer and far in between. Say, for example, strong access to educational opportunities, good access to healthcare, good access to transport to be able to live and work elsewhere, or even just the opportunities provided by having loads of companies and job opportunities nearby. In London, if you can afford to work for free as an intern, you have your pick of lots and lots of companies. But in Cornwall, you might be offering to work for free, but that doesn't mean that there's anywhere necessarily for you to work. So I'm going to ask you to watch this video here to find out a little bit more. So the link is just here. I will also put it on the next slide as a video you can watch in the PowerPoint. And there are 2 short questions I'd like you to answer. So once you have watched this video, I would like you to answer a couple of questions, just 2 of them. The first is, what is Noah so worried about when he leaves school? What is his concern? And hopefully, if you've watched the video, that doesn't make sense. So once you have had the opportunity to watch this video, there are 2 short questions I want you to answer. The first is, what is Noah's concern for when he leaves school? And the second is, what is this postcard project that he's doing supposed to do? What's the purpose of it? So have a little look at the video, please. It's only 3.5 minutes long, and I'll see you in a moment. So, what Noah is worried about when he leaves school, he is simply worried about finding a job opportunity, having a job. And even if he does manage to find himself a job opportunity, he's worried that the wages are far too low to be able to survive on. His project then is about creating postcards, and these postcards have a lovely image, a stereotypical image of Cornwall on them, and then they have a scratch-off panel, and that scratch-off panel is revealing the reality of poverty that exists in Cornwall. We saw in that video clip the food bank that is operating in Cornwall, and this is not an uncommon thing. In fact, it might shock you, but in the UK we have more food banks than we do branches of McDonald's. So even if you just think about how common it is to see a branch of McDonald's, the fast food chain, we actually have more food banks in the UK than we do have branches of McDonald's. And really and truly, the number of food banks that we have here in the UK are a really high indication of how many people, despite our wealth on a global level, are actually struggling to get by on a day-to-day basis. So, what has caused this deprivation? There are 2 things that we're going to look at here. The first is a really key concept, and it's one that we've mentioned previously, this idea that there is a core area, an area that attracts a huge amount of investment, areas that are very often urban, that draw in money, they draw in investment, they draw in population, they draw people in to migrate, and that puts them at the heart, at the centre of economic activity. Meanwhile, you have regions or areas that are on the periphery, they're on the edges, and they kind of get left behind in the sense of economic activity, whether that's in terms of attracting investment or in terms of attention from central government. So one of the main reasons for Cornwall's deprivation is its remoteness. It's actually really far away. It's all the way down in this southwest tip of England. And that's partly why it's considered a periphery area. So to be on the periphery is to be on the edge of something, just like the edge of your vision is called your peripheral vision. Areas with lots of economic activity are considered the core. So London is an obvious core, but equally the northern powerhouse, those major cities of Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield and Nottingham, they're also core regions in the UK. So my task for you is this, very simple. What are the impacts for areas like Cornwall that are in the periphery? I've mentioned a couple of them already, but can you just bullet point them, please? What things do you find in a periphery area on the edge that by comparison to a core area? Okay, so let's have a think specifically then about Cornwall. You have a task on your sheet which is a gap fill, and I know that seems a bit simple, but we're really looking to get you to soak up lots of information today. So I'd like you to use this information I'm going to go through now to complete your gap fill. So obviously reading it and adding in the words as you go. So the first thing is the situation, that's its location. The county of Cornwall is long, and road and trail transport, as we mentioned at the very start of the lesson, is quite slow. There are no huge population centres, no major cities, so there's no central hub that sort of attracts businesses to base themselves there. It has also been a really, really unfortunate victim of the decline in primary industries. For many years, Cornwall's major industries have been agriculture, fishing, and mining, and in particular, famously, Cornwall's coal mines and its miners were a huge source of pride for the county. But as we've moved away from coal as a major source of energy, and as the coal seams in Cornwall started to run out, the poverty as coal mines closed and the employment opportunities were lost has risen. Very famously, of course, Cornwall is known for its pasties, its Cornish pasties, which have a very thick crust on them. And it was said that the pasty was designed with that thick crust so that miners could take them down the mines, and if they held the pasty by the crust, they wouldn't eat any of the dirt that was on their hands. So another couple of reasons then, following the dependence on fishing and farming and mining that we've just discussed, a lot of Cornwall's income does come from tourism. The problem with tourism, of course, is that it's very seasonal work. Not many people are looking to go to the seaside in November and December. So although there might be lots of jobs and lots of visitors to bring in money in the summer and in the harvest season, actually those sorts of jobs don't last all year, and so they're not a reliable source of income. As well as that, working as a waiter or waitress or helping out with tourist work might not be a particularly high-paid job, especially when you compare it to professional service industries such as finance or legal work. There is a lack of job opportunities, and this leads a large number of young people to leave the area to find more employment. And that actually causes more problems. When young people leave an area, they leave behind an ageing population, and that ageing population can become a drain on taxpayer funds, especially when there are less people working in the local area to pay the taxes. Finally, then also, you've got a lack of services. There are not enough people to warrant things like a tube system, so slower transport like buses is having to be used. And if there are people leaving, say for instance young people leaving for major towns and cities elsewhere in the country, then certain services are likely to shut down. They become too expensive if not enough people visit them. Say, for example, if you've got a small village with a primary school, but there aren't enough young families having children, and the number of children in the primary school goes down and down, once you get to anything around sort of 10 children in a class, you've got to really close the school and you've got to send the kids to a neighbouring town or village. And this can happen not just with schools, but with shops and other services. And it creates what we would consider a cycle of decline. So just like we talked about a cycle of decline in urban areas following the loss of industry, the same thing has happened in rural areas. The difference is that in rural areas, regeneration is a bit harder to make happen. So we're going to move on now that you've done that gap fill to doing some practice questions, and I'd like you to go on to Caboodle, which is your online textbook access, and read pages 194 and 195. On page 195 there are 4 questions that I'd like you to answer. I have put them here as well, and the next slide shows you figures 4 and 5, which are asked for in questions 4 and 5, and that should help you do the comparisons. But effectively what I want you to do is read a little bit more information about Cornwall and its economic problems, and start to explain in your own words how those problems are perpetuated, and looking at comparing Cornwall with London. And I think you might find some of that quite surprising. So here is those 2 figures 4 and 5, the tables to compare London and Cornwall with. So pausing the video, doing those questions for me please, and then we'll be going through some answers. Some of the answers to these questions, just to draw your attention before we get to the answers, to some of the information that's on here. So most of the categories that are in these 2 tables are the same, even though they've been laid out slightly differently. So they compare income, employment levels, health and disability, education, skills and training, housing and services, crime and living environment. And you might remember, I really hope you do remember, that these categories are pretty much the same ones we were talking about when we were talking about deprivation in East London. So for most of these things, where they have low income or low levels of employment, these are negatives. They're really, really problematic. So, the indication of what it measures, how many people are on low incomes, that's the same in both tables. There should be no difference there, yeah? But the question is, what does the indicator come out and say about those places? So what we notice is, of course, starting off with, London income levels and employment levels are really high, and this is partly the product of being one of those core regions. We can also notice that income, by contrast, in Cornwall is very low. Health and disability is also quite low. The only ones that maybe they have in common are education, skills and training, which are both quite low. So we'll come back to this table in a few moments, just once we've looked at some answers. So first question, explain why the decline of Cornwall's primary industry, so reminding ourselves that is fishing, farming and mining, have made its economic problems worse. And the main reason behind this, of course, is that there has been a fall in the number of permanent full-time jobs. You've got to think, people used to leave school and go and work in jobs that they knew they would have for life, and that is no longer the reality in Cornwall. And so what that's led to is a falling average income, and that has a knock-on effect in other industries. So say, for example, if there used to be a thriving restaurant industry in Cornwall, or other services that were supported by miners and farmers having a lot more income, as that falls, the other industries are affected too. Rural areas often have poorer services like schools, doctors or buses than urban areas. Why is that? Can you explain it? And the ultimate reason for this is, of course, the fact that they have a smaller population, and because they're spread out, and a great word used here in the answers is dispersed pattern. So to be spread out is to be dispersed. So that dispersed pattern means that they might have to travel really long distances to reach services like schools and doctors. Private services like bus companies are not often going to work out. They might not be economically viable. They might not have enough passengers to be able to bother running that. So what it does is it pushes the cost of a lot of services up. So questions 4 and 5 here, they do require the use of those 2 tables we were just looking at. And the first thing is it's asking us to compare the Index of Multiple Deprivation, that's IMD, scores for London for those with Cornwall. And those things that we were just talking about, that Cornwall has lower income, lower employment, lower levels of health and disability, but it also has lower levels of crime and services. Whereas the same indicators for education, skills and training, and for housing, that they are both in a real predicament around housing. Now, housing is an interesting one, because you might look at somewhere like Cornwall and think, how can they have a shortage of housing? Housing in London is very expensive, but in rural areas, generally, it tends to be a lot cheaper. Cornwall is in a sticky situation here though, because it is such an attractive tourist destination that some very wealthy people choose to buy holiday homes in Cornwall. And what that does is it pushes demand for housing in Cornwall up, and it raises the prices in Cornwall. But as we've already discussed, the incomes of local people in Cornwall have remained low, and that means that a lot of people in Cornwall struggle to be able to buy a house at an affordable price. So that's actually something that they have in common with the capital. One of the major things that Cornwall does have as an advantage, of course, compared with London, is the living environment. Lower levels of air pollution, much higher levels of access to green space. Okay, so, there's not to be underestimated, it is really important, but on balance, would you rather have lots of green space available to you, or would you rather know that it was possible to find a job and have an income? And, it's a difficult one, but I think most people will come down on the economic argument being more important than the environmental one if it means living in absolute poverty. Final question then. Using figure 4, explain why the elderly and the young are most affected by the indicators. This question is actually asking you, using these, to start to extrapolate. Who is affected by each of these different things? So say, for example, which of these things is going to affect elderly people more? Well, I hope you've worked out health and disability as an indicator of deprivation is going to have a disproportionate impact on older people. And of course, the opposite of that is a lack of education, skills and training is going to have a disproportionate impact on young people. Some of the others will still have an impact. As we've already mentioned, youth unemployment in Cornwall is really very, very high. Even though it isn't, insanely high across the board, it is higher in younger people. And that's one of the reasons that so many young people choose to leave. And things like lack of access to housing is really, really difficult. So in particular, elderly people and young people are likely to have lower incomes. They're likely to earn less money, and that leads to them having a poor quality of life. They live in poor levels of housing or substandard housing. They're more likely to need access to doctors, particularly old people, and young people need access to education and training. So these are real risk factors for those parts of our communities. Very last thing for today then, a quick 4-mark exam question. Explaining how economic change has affected one rural area you have studied. And we've just spent the whole lesson talking about Cornwall. So 2 points because this is a 4-mark question and you're going to develop and explain that point. You want to talk about 2 specific economic changes. Maybe pick a past change, maybe pick something that's happening now. Pause the video, answer the question. I'll see you in a moment. We're looking at this question. We've got to focus on one specific rural area and hopefully you've come up with 2 points. So you could have made a point perhaps about declining primary industries. You might have made a point about the types of jobs that are available, particularly seasonal and low paid work. You might have made a point about deprivation as a result of low incomes, or you may have made a point about rising house prices. So there's quite a few things that we could have mentioned here. Some examples here, it's not limited to get the marks to these examples, but this is how we would develop a point, okay? So we would say a specific rural area we've studied. In Cornwall, many jobs are dependent on tourism. And the problem with this is that they are seasonal or part-time, and they are often paid at minimum wages, which is not enough to live on, yeah? You could have talked about the decline in primary industries had led to a loss of jobs, a fall in the number of people who are able to be employed by those industries. And in particular in Cornwall, we know that 10,000 people have lost their jobs in the china clay industry since the 1960s. There were a few examples in the caboodle pages that we read. Another example, again, primary industry jobs, but we're saying that they've been replaced in this case by service industry jobs. And those service industry jobs, as we've mentioned, have low wages. And it leads to Cornwall having the lowest weekly wage in the UK at only £340 a week. Now, one last thing for us to note before we end the lesson is that it's very clear you need to mention 2 things about one area. You can't talk about Cornwall and then also talk about Newcastle, okay? And of course, because it is specific about a rural area, you can't talk about an urban area. Guys, thank you very much for doing the lesson today. I will see you for the last lesson in the unit next lesson, and then we'll be doing an assessment. Have a great afternoon. See you later.